Welcome to the deep dive. Tonight, we're moving beyond the familiar tales of the historical witch trials, the ones we often just think of as superstition. We're diving into something more unsettling, a theory that suggests these trials were, well, maybe not random at all, possibly a deliberate campaign.
That's exactly the idea. And our mission really is to unpack the core arguments behind this, let's call it alternative narrative.
Okay.
We'll look at the evidence proponents use and, contrast that with the mainstream historical explanations. We're drawing on historical accounts, some folklore, and critical analyses.
Right. And it's fascinating because it really challenges how we usually think about this whole dark chapter, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It asks us to rethink quite a bit.
Okay, so maybe let's start with the basics, the traditional understanding. What are the key elements of the mainstream view of the witch trials?
Well, the conventional view really hinges on a very widespread, very genuine belief in magic, both, helpful magic and harmful magic. And then you add the religious context. The intense period of the Reformation, that big split in Western Christianity, and the Catholic Church's reaction, the Counter-Reformation, it created this climate of fear.
Fear of the devil.
Exactly. Fear of the devil, fear of his supposed agents, witches, and any deviation from strict religious rules, any kind of heresy, got tangled up with witchcraft accusations very quickly.
So it wasn't just about religious dogma then. I seem to remember social and economic stuff played a big part too.
Oh, a huge part. Absolutely. You had times of major upheaval, economic hardship, famine, disease.
People needed someone to blame.
Precisely. Scapegoating. And individuals already on the fringes, older women, maybe, the poor, people who didn't quite fit in, they were easy targets.
And these accusations could spread fast.
Like wildfire.
Yeah.
Local fears, personal grudges, pure suspicion. It could snowball into these huge panics, and tragically, confessions were often forced out through torture.
Which ironically just seemed to confirm everyone's fears.
Right. It made the beliefs seem true, no matter how bizarre they look to us now. And the legal systems back then, well, they were heavily influenced by all this, the religious beliefs, the societal panic, deeply flawed by our standards.
Okay, so that's the standard picture: mass belief, social stress, local panics. But what started making people think, hang on, maybe there's more to this? What were the clues that pointed towards something planned?
Well, several things kind of nod at that simple explanation. First, just the sheer scale of it all.
Do you mean how widespread it was?
Yeah, the geography, vast areas of Europe, even crossing the Atlantic to colonial America. And the time spans centuries. We're talking tens of thousands of people persecuted. That alone. Seems like more than just scattered local hysterias, Then there's the pattern of who was targeted. It wasn't random.
Women, mostly.
Overwhelmingly women. And the conspiracy theory asks, was that just bias? Or was it a deliberate strategy? Maybe to undermine female influence or power?
That why women question really does seem central to this alternative idea.
It's absolutely central. And then look at who was involved.
Right.
You had political authorities, religious authorities actively prosecuting. That suggests a level of organization, doesn't it? More than just village gossip getting out of hand.
And maybe other motives involved too.
That's another point. The consequences. Property was confiscated. Fear was used to control people. So you start to wonder, were there economic or political gains to be made? And finally, modern ways of looking at history, feminist perspectives on patriarchy, Marxist views on class conflict, sociological analysis of social control, they provide new frameworks, ways to see these events potentially driven by power struggles, which can sometimes lead towards conspiracy interpretations.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. Let's dig into the core claims of this witch trial conspiracy theory. What's the proposed real story behind it all?
Okay, so the fundamental idea is that the witch trials weren't accidental. They were, according to this theory, a deliberate campaign, maybe not always centrally coordinated like a modern plot, but driven by powerful groups with specific goals.
And the first goal being?
Systematic oppression. The idea that it was a targeted attack, mainly against women, because they were seen somehow as a threat to the established order, the patriarchal system.
A threat. How, specifically? In what way were women perceived as threatening?
Well, that leads to another key idea: controlling knowledge and power. The theory suggests that by labeling certain women, often healers or midwives, as witches, authorities were actively suppressing traditional knowledge held mainly by women about herbs, healing, childbirth. This helped consolidate power in the hands of male-dominated institutions. The church, yes, but also the new emerging fields of quote-unquote proper science and medicine.
So it wasn't just about squashing competing religious ideas, but also about controlling expertise, controlling professions.
Exactly, and tied into that is economic gain. Let's be blunt.
Yeah.
When someone was convicted of witchcraft, their property was often seized.
Right.
So was that just a side effect, or was it sometimes a motive? Especially if the accused had land or money. It turns accusations into a potential way to grab assets.
A pretty cynical motive, if true.
Definitely. And politically, think about unstable times, rulers facing challenges. Witchcraft accusations could be a weapon, couldn't they?
To silence critics, get rid of rivals.
Precisely. A convenient way to eliminate opposition and shore up your own power by painting defenders as evil, as allied with the devil.
Using supernatural fear for very earthly control.
That's the argument. And it links directly to enforcing religious orthodoxy. The trials were a brutal tool to stamp out any beliefs or practices that didn't fit the dominant religious narrative. Deviate, and you risk being branded a witch.
And using witches as scapegoats for bigger problems.
Yes, that's another tenet. Got a plague, famine, social unrest, blame the witches. It diverts anger from the rulers, reinforces the existing social structure through fear, keeps people in line.
What about the image of the witch itself, the cackling old hag stereotype? Does the theory say anything about that?
Absolutely. It argues that stereotype wasn't just organic folklore, it was actively constructed and spread. Think about influential texts like the Malleus Maleficarum.
The Hammer of Witches.
Right. That book wasn't just a manual for witch hunters. It was propaganda. It helped define what a witch was, painting this terrifying, malevolent picture to justify the persecution and make people afraid.
So the image itself was a tool of the conspiracy.
According to the theory, yes. And one last point. While trials were often local, proponents of this view point to the similarities. The consistency in accusations, blaming witches for crop failures, illness, dead livestock, and the similar methods used across different regions. Does that suggest maybe a shared ideology, perhaps even some level of communication or influence between authorities in different places?
Yes. Okay, so those are the main pillars of the theory. Systematic oppression, control of knowledge, economic gain, political control, enforcing orthodoxy, scapegoating, constructing the stereotype, and maybe some cross-regional influence.
No.
Now, what evidence do people point to? How do they interpret historical events to back this up?
Well, a big one, as we mentioned, is the gender disparity, the fact that the vast majority of victims were women. This is seen as almost prima facie evidence of a patriarchal campaign to curb female independence and power.
And the targeting of healers and midwives fits into that.
Exactly. That's interpreted as a direct attack on female knowledge systems, clearing the way for male-dominated medicine. Then, the economic angle they point to, specific cases where property confiscation clearly benefited the accusers or the authorities.
So, following the money, essentially.
Following the money or the land.
Yeah.
And also looking at who got accused politically. Were they people challenging the powers that be? If so, the accusation looks less like genuine belief and more like a convenient political tool.
Right.
The Malleus Maleficarum comes up again here. Its huge influence across Europe is presented as evidence of, if not a central command, at least a coordinated ideological push that fueled the trials.
That book does seem like a smoking gun in a way for shaping the whole phenomenon.
It was incredibly potent. Then, the consistency of accusations we talked about, the same themes popping up everywhere, is that just coincidence, or does it point to a common script, maybe pushed from above? And the use of torture. Mainstream history might say, well, that was just how legal systems worked then. But this theory argues it was more calculated, a systematic way to generate the confessions needed to make the whole narrative seem real and justify more persecution.
Forcing the evidence, basically.
Forcing the evidence. Even the way negative female stereotypes linger today, some argue that's a cultural echo of this historical campaign of demonization. And finally, there's this idea that the decline of witch trials, coinciding with the rise of science, wasn't just about enlightenment, but about actively suppressing an older, perhaps magical worldview to make way for scientific dominance.
Wow. It's definitely a compelling narrative, even if it's disturbing. But let's bring in the counter-arguments. What does the mainstream historical consensus say in response to these points? How do they explain the same events differently?
Okay, so mainstream historians generally push back against the idea of a single, overarching conspiracy. They emphasize, first and foremost, the genuine belief factor.
People really did believe in harmful witchcraft.
Deeply. It was woven into the fabric of society, high and low. So while the trials were horrific, they often stemmed from that sincere, if misguided, belief, not necessarily a hidden agenda. They also stressed the local nature of most trials.
More bottom-up than top-down.
Largely, yes. Accusations often started with neighbors, fueled by local disputes, anxieties, maybe a crop failure or illness in the village. There wasn't usually some central office directing things. The legal systems, the religious authorities, they varied a lot from place to place. That argues against a unified, centrally controlled plan.
So, less coordination.
Much less evidence of widespread coordination. And while authorities were involved, often popular pressure, fear, and belief within the community forced their hand. People demanded action against suspected witches.
It wasn't always imposed from above.
Not always, no.
Yeah.
Also, the understanding of witchcraft, the methods used in trials. These things changed over time. It looks more like an organic evolution of beliefs and practices, not a static plan being executed.
And the gender aspect. How does the mainstream view explain why so many women were targeted, if not a deliberate male conspiracy?
It's seen as more complex.
Yeah.
Yes, patriarchy was a huge factor. Existing beliefs about women being weaker, more susceptible to the devil associated with nature of the body. But also, women, particularly poor, elderly, or widowed women, were often more socially vulnerable, making them easier targets in times of stress. It wasn't necessarily one single conspiracy, but a confluence of existing biases and vulnerabilities.
Okay.
And finally, the decline of the trials. Mainstream history generally credits growing skepticism, the influence of Enlightenment thinking, and reforms in legal procedures, things like demanding better evidence, questioning torture rather than some conspiracy being suddenly exposed or abandoned.
It seems the core disagreement boils down to intentionality, doesn't it? Conspiracy theory sees deliberate, planned action by powerful groups. Mainstream view sees a complex mix of genuine belief, social pressures, local dynamics, and existing biases that resulted in systemic horror, but without that central hidden plot.
That's a really good way to put it. And you can see why the conspiracy idea persists. I mean, the sheer horror of the trials. It makes you want a bigger explanation than just people were superstitious.
Right, it feels inadequate somehow.
Exactly. And sadly, themes like targeting marginalized groups, using fear for control. I think the crucial point is this. Even if you don't buy into a full-blown, centrally run conspiracy, and the evidence for that specific model is debatable, the theory forces us to see that the witch trials weren't just random superstition.
They served a purpose within the system.
Exactly. They were deeply tied into the social, political, economic, and religious power structures of the time. They reinforced those structures, often brutally. They suppressed dissent, controlled populations. Understanding the trials means understanding that whole context, not just writing it off as irrational fear.
So the systemic nature of the oppression is undeniable, even if a specific unified conspiracy is harder to prove.
Precisely. The demonization and persecution of specific groups, especially women, to benefit the powerful. That's a historical reality we have to grapple with, whether it was a meticulously planned plot or the grim outcome of interlocking beliefs and pressures.
Which leaves us, and you the listener, with a pretty challenging thought. When we look back at huge historical injustices, like the witch trials, are we reading too much into it by seeing a deliberate conspiracy behind systemic oppression? Or does the sheer scale, the patterns, the devastating impact actually hint at more coordination, more intent than the standard histories sometimes acknowledge?
It's a tough question.
It really is something to keep pondering. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into a very complex and frankly chilling piece of history.